Most people don't have a thinking problem. They have a pretending problem. And the terrifying part is that the pretending is so smooth, so habitual, so deeply wired into the way you move through your day that you've stopped noticing you're doing it at all. You sit in rooms full of ideas you don't fully understand. You use words whose weight you've never actually measured. You build plans on top of assumptions you've never once pressure tested. And then when things fall apart, when the project fails, when the answer doesn't come, you tell yourself it was bad luck, bad timing, bad circumstances. It was none of those things. It was the foundation. It was always the foundation. Here is what nobody says out loud. The majority of intelligent people walking this planet are operating on borrowed understanding. They've collected explanations the way you collect receipts, stuffed in a pocket, never examined, forgotten until something goes wrong. They've mistaken exposure for comprehension. They've confused familiarity with mastery. And because everyone around them is doing the same thing, there's no friction, no moment of reckoning, no one to pull the thread and watch the whole sweater unravel until there is. Until the problem gets hard enough, until the stakes get high enough, until the situation demands not a rehearsed answer but a real one, built from the ground up from actual understanding under actual pressure. That's when the gap reveals itself. That's when years of nodding along, years of surface-level engagement, years of intellectual shortcuts come due all at once. And most people in that moment freeze. Not because they're not intelligent, but because they were never trained to think from the bottom up. They were only ever trained to recall from the top down. That changes right now. There is a specific kind of ignorance that is far more dangerous than the ordinary kind, and it is the ignorance that doesn't know it's ignorant. It wears the costume of knowledge. It speaks with confidence. It references the right terms, cites the familiar names, moves through conversations without ever triggering suspicion, including its own. This is the illusion of explanatory depth, and it is not a rare condition affecting a careless few. It is the default state of the human mind, and there is a near certain chance it is quietly governing more of your thinking than you have ever been willing to admit. Here is how it works inside you. You encounter a concept in a book, a conversation, a lecture, a headline. Your brain registers it, files it, tags it as understood. And from that moment forward, every time that concept surfaces, your brain doesn't re-examine it. It simply retrieves the tag. Known, familiar, understood. The tag feels like comprehension. It is not comprehension. It is a placeholder wearing comprehension's clothes. And the difference between the two only becomes visible when something actually demands that you use what you claim to know. The brutal test is always the same. Explain it without the vocabulary. Strip away every technical term, every borrowed phrase, every piece of language you inherited from the source instead of building yourself, and articulate the idea using nothing but your own words, your own logic, your own constructed understanding. Most people cannot do this for the majority of things they believe they know, not because they are unintelligent, because they were never asked to, because the world rarely demands real understanding when performed understanding moves just as smoothly through daily life. But hard problems are not daily life. Hard problems are audits. They examine everything you've claimed to deposit, and they do not accept receipts as proof. They want the thing itself, raw, undecorated, structurally sound, and if it isn't there, no amount of confident language will manufacture it on the spot. This is where the illusion collapses. This is where the gap between knowing the name of something and knowing the thing itself becomes not a philosophical distinction but a practical catastrophe. And the only way out is the one most people are too proud to take, admitting, fully and without softening it, that you do not yet understand what you thought you already did. Before a single answer can be found, before a single framework can be applied, before the mind can do any meaningful work at all, something far more foundational has to happen. The problem has to be named, not approximated, not gestured at, not described in the comfortable, vague language that lets you feel like you've begun without actually requiring you to commit to anything. Named, precisely, honestly, in terms so clear and so specific that there is no room left for ambiguity to hide inside them. This sounds simple. It is not. It is, in fact, the step where the overwhelming majority of intelligent people fail before they ever realize the game has started. The reason is uncomfortable, but it needs to be said directly. Most people are not solving the problem they think they are solving. They are solving the version of the problem that is easiest to articulate, or the version that is least threatening to their self-image, or the version that conveniently points blame outward rather than inward. They treat the symptom because naming the symptom requires no courage. They optimize the surface because excavating to the root means confronting things they have spent considerable energy avoiding. And so they work, genuinely, effortfully, sometimes brilliantly, on the wrong problem. And then they wonder why the right answer never comes. This is not laziness. This is self-protection operating at a level below conscious awareness. The mind is extraordinarily skilled at presenting you with a problem that feels real, feels urgent, feels worth solving, while keeping the actual problem just far enough out of frame that you never have to face it directly. It substitutes the manageable for the meaningful. It offers you the satisfaction of effort without the discomfort of truth. And unless you have developed the specific discipline of questioning the problem itself before attempting to solve it, you will fall for this substitution every single time. The discipline begins with one unforgiving question asked before anything else. What is actually broken? Not what feels broken, not what looks broken from the outside, not what would be convenient to have broken because fixing it would be within your current skill set. What is actually, structurally, fundamentally broken, and what evidence do you have that your diagnosis is real rather than comfortable? If you cannot answer that in one clean, unambiguous sentence, you are not ready to solve anything yet. You are still at the beginning, whether you feel like it or not. Once the problem has been named with honesty and precision, the next move is the one that separates genuine thinkers from everyone else, and it is not a move that feels productive, which is exactly why most people skip it entirely. The move is demolition. Controlled, deliberate, total demolition of every assumption that has attached itself to the problem like barnacles to a hull. Everyone knows that. This is just how it works. Every inherited belief, every borrowed framework, every conclusion you arrived at not through examination but through repetition. All of it has to come down before anything real can be built in its place. Not some of it, not the assumptions you feel comfortable questioning. All of it. This is what thinking from first principles actually means, and it is almost nothing like the way the phrase gets used in casual conversation. People invoke first principles the way they invoke other impressive-sounding ideas, as decoration, as signal, as a way of suggesting depth without descending into it. Real first principles thinking is not a mindset. It is not an attitude. It is a specific, grueling intellectual process in which you refuse to accept any premise as valid until you have personally traced it back to something that is true independent of anyone's opinion, independent of tradition, independent of what has always been done. It means asking not how has this been approached before, but what is irreducibly true about this situation. And those two questions, though they sound adjacent, lead to completely different places. The difficulty is that your previous experience, the very thing that makes you capable and competent in familiar territory, becomes a liability here. Experience pattern matches. It looks at a new problem and immediately begins scanning for resemblance to old problems, because resemblance is faster than analysis, and the brain is, above all else, an efficiency machine. When it finds a match, it stops looking. It imports the old solution, adjusts it slightly for cosmetic differences, and presents it to you as original thinking. And because the process happens below the threshold of awareness, you accept it. You feel like you're reasoning when you are actually remembering. You feel like you're solving when you are actually recycling. Stripping a problem to the bone means catching that process in the act and refusing to let it finish. It means sitting with a problem in a state of genuine not knowing, no templates, no precedents, no safety nets of prior experience, and staying there long enough for something real to emerge. That patience, that willingness to remain in uncertainty without grasping for the nearest familiar answer, is not a personality trait some people are born with. It is a skill. It is built through practice and through the repeated, deliberate choice to be uncomfortable rather than wrong. There is a moment that every serious thinker eventually encounters, and it arrives not in a lecture hall or a boardroom or a moment of quiet reflection, but in the middle of an attempt to explain something, out loud, in plain language, to someone who knows nothing about it, when the words simply stop coming. Not because the idea is too complex to verbalize, because the idea was never truly understood in the first place. The sentence stalls, the logic loops back on itself. The explanation reaches for a technical term not because the term is necessary, but because without it there is nothing there, no actual understanding beneath the vocabulary, no real structure beneath the scaffolding of borrowed language. And in that silence, in that specific and deeply uncomfortable pause, the truth of what you actually know versus what you merely believed you knew becomes impossible to avoid. This test, the act of explaining something from scratch, without jargon, without credentials, without the protective armor of complexity, is the most accurate diagnostic tool available to any thinking person. It costs nothing, it requires no equipment, it demands only honesty and the willingness to be exposed. And it will reveal with a precision that no exam or performance review ever could, exactly where your understanding is solid and exactly where it is theater. Every stumble is a data point. Every circular sentence is a confession. Every moment you reach for a term instead of an idea is a precise coordinate marking the boundary of what you genuinely own versus what you have merely borrowed and never examined. Most people encounter this moment and do one of two things. They either abandon the explanation entirely, retreating behind the claim that the subject is simply too nuanced, too technical, too layered to reduce to plain language, or they push through with false confidence, papering over the gaps with authoritative tone, and hoping the listener won't notice the hollowness underneath. Both responses are forms of the same refusal. The refusal to sit in the exposure of not knowing and treat it as useful information rather than personal failure. Both responses guarantee that the gap remains exactly where it is, invisible and unaddressed, ready to reappear at the worst possible moment when the stakes are real and the audience is unforgiving. The only productive response to that moment of stalling, the only one that actually moves understanding forward, is to stop, to resist every instinct towards self-protection, to look directly at the place where the explanation broke down and say, with complete intellectual honesty, that this is the edge. This is the precise location where genuine knowledge ends and comfortable assumption begins. Because that edge is not a destination to be ashamed of, it is a starting point. It is the most valuable piece of information the thinking process can generate, a clear, unambiguous signal pointing to exactly where the real work needs to happen next. The people who solve hard problems are not the people who never hit that wall. They are the people who have learned to treat hitting it not as failure but as orientation. The wall tells you where to dig, and digging, uncomfortable and slow and ego-dissolving as it is the only way through. The gap has been found. The exact location where understanding dissolves into assumption has been identified with uncomfortable clarity. And now comes the moment that defines everything. Not the discovery of the gap, because anyone willing to be honest with themselves can find the gap, but what happens in the seconds immediately after. Because in those seconds, two paths present themselves with equal plausibility and wildly unequal consequences. The first path is the one most people take without even recognizing it as a choice. They acknowledge the gap loosely, they feel the mild discomfort of it, and then they move forward anyway, carrying the unresolved uncertainty with them like an unpaid debt. They've decided to ignore because the immediate cost of addressing it feels higher than the distant cost of leaving it unattended. The second path requires something that does not come naturally to a mind that has been rewarded, for most of its life, for the appearance of knowing rather than the substance of it. It requires going back, not skimming back, not revisiting a summary or a second-hand explanation or a simplified version that makes the concept feel resolved without actually resolving it. Going back means returning to the source material, the original idea in its rawest, most unprocessed form, and engaging with it at the level of depth that the gap demands. It means resisting every shortcut the mind offers, and the mind will offer many, because shortcuts feel like efficiency, and efficiency feels like intelligence. And the entire architecture of modern information consumption has been built to reinforce that feeling at the direct expense of actual comprehension. A summary is not understanding. A highlight is not understanding. A well-produced explanation that makes a complex idea feel simple in 12 minutes is not understanding. These things are maps. And a map, no matter how beautifully drawn, is not the territory. When the territory is what you need, the map will betray you. What going back actually looks like is slow. Frustratingly, almost insultingly slow compared to the pace at which information is consumed in every other area of life. It looks like reading a single paragraph and stopping. Not because the paragraph was unclear, but because something in it triggered a question, and that question deserves to be followed before the next paragraph begins. It looks like writing out an idea in your own constructed sentences and discovering midway through that the sentence doesn't hold, that the logic fractures under the weight of its own implications, and then starting again. It looks like the same concept approached from 3 different angles on 3 different days because the first 2 angles revealed only partial structure and the third finally made the architect.
Frankie.
This is not inefficiency. This is what filling a gap actually requires when the gap is real and the stakes of leaving it unfilled are consequential. And then the gap has been genuinely addressed, not papered over, not approximately resolved, but actually filled with understanding that can withstand the explanation test, should survive being spoken aloud in plain language without collapsing. The process begins again. Because filling one gap with real understanding almost always illuminates the next one. Genuine comprehension is not a destination that once reached stays reached. It is a living structure that reveals new edges the more solidly its existing edges are built. The cycle does not end. The people who have internalized this not as a burden but as the natural rhythm of serious thinking are the people whose understanding compounds over time in ways that eventually become inexplicable to everyone around them, not because they are exceptional, but because they never stopped going back. There is a performance that happens in almost every professional environment, every academic setting, every space where intelligent people gather to discuss difficult things. And once you learn to see it, you cannot unsee it. It is the performance of complexity. It is the deliberate strategic deployment of dense language, layered terminology, and elaborate conceptual architecture, not in service of genuine understanding, but in service of concealment. Concealment of thin thinking, concealment of unexamined assumptions, concealment of the yawning gap between what is being projected and what is actually known. It happens in boardrooms, where strategy documents are written in language so abstract that no one can be held accountable for what they actually mean. It happens in academic papers where conclusions are buried under methodological language so dense that the weakness of the underlying reasoning becomes invisible to everyone except the people willing to spend days excavating it. It happens in conversations between people who have silently agreed, without ever stating the agreement out loud, to never question each other's vocabulary, because doing so would require them to question their own. Complexity, in these contexts, is not a feature of the subject being discussed. It is a feature of the relationship between the speaker and the subject. Specifically, this is a signal that the relationship is not as solid as the language being used to describe it would suggest. Genuine understanding. Real understanding that has been built from the ground up through the process of stripping assumptions and filling gaps and testing explanations against the brutal standard of plain language. That kind of understanding almost always expresses itself simply, not simplistically. There is a critical difference that cannot be collapsed without losing something essential. Simplistic means stripped of necessary nuance, flattened into a version that is easier to digest but no longer fully true. Simple means expressed in the most direct, economical language that preserves the full weight and accuracy of the idea. The simplistic explanation lies by omission. The simple explanation illuminates by precision. And the person who truly understands something can move between levels of complexity at will, can speak to the specialist and to the newcomer with equal accuracy and equal clarity, because their understanding is not dependent on the vocabulary. The vocabulary is just clothing. The understanding is the body underneath, and it exists independently of what it's wearing. This is the test you need to start applying to everything you consume and everyone you listen to, including yourself. When an explanation gets more complex at exactly the moment you ask a clarifying question, that is not depth revealing itself, that is defense activating. When a concept requires an ever-expanding glossary of specialized terms before it can even be approached, ask yourself whether the terms are serving the idea or shielding it. When someone responds to a simple question with an answer that makes you feel less clear than you were before you asked, do not assume the fault lies in your inability to follow. Consider the possibility that there was nothing clear to follow in the first place. This is not cynicism. This is the necessary and overdue application of intellectual honesty to the information you allow to shape your thinking. Because the ideas you cannot see through are the ideas that control you. And the moment you develop the ability to distinguish genuine complexity from performed complexity, you will discover that a remarkable proportion of what has been presented to you as profound is, at its core, either poorly understood by the person presenting it or deliberately obscured to prevent you from realizing how little substance lives beneath the surface. Either way, the response is the same. Go back to first principles, strip the language away, and find out what, if anything, remains when the complexity has nowhere left to hide. There is a conversation that almost never happens but needs to happen urgently, and it is the conversation about why intelligent people, genuinely capable, deeply motivated, sincerely committed people, still fail to think through hard problems with any real effectiveness. The answer that gets offered most frequently is the wrong one. It points to access to education, to resources, to the presence or absence of the right mentors at the right moments. These things matter at the margins. They are not the core. The core is something far less flattering and far more actionable, and it is this. The thinking fails not because the mind is insufficient, but because the mind is impatient. Specifically, catastrophically, almost universally impatient with the experience of not yet knowing, with the suspended, uncomfortable, directionless feeling of sitting inside a problem that has not resolved itself and showing no immediate signs of doing so. That feeling, uncertainty held without resolution, is the exact feeling that produces breakthrough thinking when it is tolerated long enough. And it is the exact feeling that most people will do almost anything to escape the moment it appears. The escape routes are everywhere, and they are sophisticated enough that using them feels like progress. Reading another article about the problem feels like engagement. Discussing it with someone who shares your existing assumptions feels like collaboration. Restructuring your notes feels like synthesis. Switching to a different aspect of the problem because this one isn't moving feels like strategic flexibility. Every one of these moves can be legitimate under the right circumstances. Every one of them becomes an escape mechanism when deployed at the precise moment that real thinking, slow, stuck, uncomfortable, apparently unproductive thinking is what the situation actually requires. The mind detects the discomfort of genuine uncertainty and immediately generates an activity that feels sufficiently intellectual to pass as thinking while successfully avoiding the specific depth that the problem demands. And because the activity feels real, because it produces tangible outputs, notes, conversations, restructured frameworks, the escape is never recognized as an escape. It is experienced as work. It is logged as effort. It is pointed to later as evidence of engagement. But the gap remains exactly where it was. The problem remains unsolved. And the quietly devastating conclusion drawn is that the problem must be harder than it looked, rather than that the thinking never actually went deep enough to touch it. What genuine patience with uncertainty looks like in practice is almost impossible to romanticize, which is part of why it is so rarely discussed in the spaces that celebrate intellectual achievement. It looks like sitting with a problem in a state of active, alert, uncomfortable not knowing for longer than feels reasonable or productive. It looks like resisting the urge to conclude prematurely, to grab the nearest plausible answer and retrofit the reasoning to support it, because the nearest plausible answer and the correct answer are almost never the same thing, and the gap between them only becomes visible to the mind that has stayed in the question long enough to see past its own initial responses. It looks like tolerating the specific anxiety of not being able to show progress in a world that rewards the performance of progress far more generously than it rewards the reality of it. This is not a romantic kind of patience. It is not meditative or peaceful or spiritually edifying. It is grinding and unglamorous, and it will make you feel repeatedly and convincingly like you are failing. That feeling is not a signal to stop. That feeling is the friction of real thinking making contact with a problem that has not yet been solved. And friction, as uncomfortable as it is the only evidence that something genuine is actually happening. The people who have learned to interpret that friction not as failure but as engagement are the people whose thinking eventually reaches places that faster, more comfortable thinking never could. There is a fork in the road that every thinking person reaches, usually multiple times across a single day, and the choice made at that fork determines not just the quality of individual decisions, but the entire trajectory of intellectual development over a lifetime. The fork does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive with clarity or ceremony. It appears quietly, almost invisibly, in the small moment between encountering new information and deciding what to do with it. On one side of the fork is the question that the ego asks, does this make me look smart? Does this confirm what I already believe? Does this strengthen the position I have already committed to in front of people whose opinion of me I care about? On the other side is the question that accuracy demands. Is this true? Is this supported by evidence I have personally examined? Does this hold when pressure is applied to it from directions I find uncomfortable? These two questions feel similar enough that the substitution of one for the other goes unnoticed in the moment. Over time, the consequences of that substitution become the difference between a mind that genuinely sharpens and a mind that merely hardens. The pursuit of looking smart is not a trivial or shallow motivation. It needs to be understood for what it actually is, a deeply embedded survival mechanism that has been shaped by every social environment you have ever inhabited. From the earliest moments of education, the reward has gone not to the student who identified the most honest gap in their understanding, but to the student who produced the most confident and well-articulated answer in the least amount of time. Not to the person who said, I need to go back and re-examine this from the foundation, but to the person who already had a response ready, already had the framework loaded, already had the vocabulary deployed before the question had fully finished being asked. The system trained you to perform comprehension faster than it trained you to build it. And because the performance was rewarded so consistently, so early, so publicly, it became indistinguishable from the real thing, not just to the people watching, but to you yourself. The performance became the default. The genuine article became the exception that required deliberate, almost countercultural effort to pursue. Becoming accurate instead of looking smart requires dismantling that default at the level where it actually operates, which is not the level of conscious decision-making, but the level of automatic response. It requires catching yourself in the act of defending a position, not because the evidence supports it, but because you stated it publicly and retreat feels like defeat. It requires noticing the specific discomfort that arrives when new information challenges something you have built part of your identity around, and choosing against every instinct to follow the information rather than protect the identity. It requires developing what can only be described as a genuine, practiced preference for being corrected over being validated. Because correction is the mechanism through which understanding actually improves, while validation is the mechanism through which it stagnates inside a comfortable illusion of solidity. This preference does not come naturally. It is built through repeated, deliberate exposure to being wrong in ways that are consequential enough to sting, and being willing to let the sting do its work, rather than numbing it with rationalization. Every time you choose accuracy over appearance, the choice becomes fractionally easier. Every time you choose appearance over accuracy, the gap between your projected understanding and your real understanding widens by exactly the amount you refuse to examine. The compounding works in both directions. The only question is which direction you are choosing, right now, in this moment, before the next piece of information arrives and the fork appears again. Everything that has been laid out across these pages, the illusion of knowing, the honest naming of problems, the demolition of assumptions, the humiliation and gift of the explanation test, the grinding patience of sitting inside uncertainty, the choice between accuracy and appearance, none of it has any value whatsoever until it makes contact with something real, with your actual life, with the specific problems sitting on your desk right now, unresolved not because they are unsolvable, but because the thinking brought to them has not yet been honest enough, deep enough, or patient enough to reach the level where solutions actually live. Ideas consumed and never applied are not knowledge. They are entertainment dressed in the clothing of self-improvement, and the world is full of people who have consumed an extraordinary volume of them without changing a single fundamental thing about the way they think or the results they produce. Do not be one of those people. Not after this. Not now that the mechanism has been named and the choice has been made explicit. The action required is not complicated, but it will be resisted by every comfort-seeking instinct the mind possesses, which is precisely why it must be stated without softening. Tonight, not this week, not when circumstances are more favorable, not after the current workload eases. Tonight, you identify one concept that sits at the center of your professional or intellectual life. One idea that you rely on, that you reference, that you build decisions around, that you would claim if asked to understand. And you sit down with it alone, without the safety net of your notes or your bookmarks or your carefully curated sources, and you attempt to explain it from absolute zero. No borrowed vocabulary, no rehearsed frameworks, no retreating to the comfortable altitude of abstraction where vagueness masquerades as sophistication. You build the explanation from the ground up, in the plainest language available to you, as if the person listening has never encountered the idea in any form and will ask a clarifying question at every point where your logic becomes convenient rather than rigorous. When the explanation stalls, and it will stall, because genuine understanding always reveals its own edges under this kind of pressure, you do not move past the stall. You do not paper over it with confidence or complexity or a pivot to adjacent territory that feels more solid. You mark the exact location where the thinking broke down, and you treat that location as the most important piece of information the entire exercise has produced, because it is. That stall is not a sign of inadequacy. It is a precise coordinate. It is the mind finally honest with itself, pointing to the exact place where real work needs to happen. Not performative work, not the kind that generates visible output and internal comfort without touching the actual problem, but the slow, unglamorous foundational work of going back to the source and rebuilding understanding from a level below where the crack appeared. This is the practice, not an event, not a technique applied once in a moment of inspiration and then returned to its shelf. A practice, something done repeatedly, with increasing honesty and increasing precision, until the gap between what you project and what you actually know begins to close in ways that change not just how you think, but what you are capable of doing with that thinking in the world. The method is now yours. The understanding of why it works, what it demands, and what it costs has been laid out without flattery or false comfort. What happens next is entirely and without exception your responsibility. Most people who have read these words will feel the weight of them for a day, perhaps two, and then allow the current of habitual thinking to carry them back to the surface where it is faster and more comfortable and far less true. A small number will not. A small number will take the discomfort seriously enough to let it change something permanent. The only question that remains, the one that no method, no framework, no amount of carefully constructed argument can answer on your behalf, is which one you have already decided to be.